In praise of the British Royal Marines that had been attached to his command since mid-November 1950, Major General Oliver P. Smith, commanding General 1st Marine Division, wrote that their services in the recently concluded Chosin Reservoir campaign made a significant contribution to the holding of Hagaru, which was vital. Hagaru. Concluded Chosin Reservoir campaign concluded the Chosin Reservoir campaign, made a significant contribution to the holding of Hagaru, which was vital to the 1st Marine Division. General Smith's comments reflected the view held by many Marines, both officers and enlisted, of the fighting abilities of both the British Cousins and the Republic of Korean Marine Corps. Vital to the 1st Marine Division. General Smith's comments reflected the views held by many Marines, both officers and enlisted, of the fighting abilities both of their British cousins and their Republic of Korea Marine Corps allies. During the 3 years they fought together on the Korean Peninsula, the British, Korean and US Marines forged bonds that still exist today. In the early morning hours of 25th of June 1950, mechanised and ground units of the North Korean People's Army, the NKPA, rolled across the 38th parallel into the neighbouring Republic of Korea. Within 48 hours, Harry S. Truman placed US forces in Japan on alert. Within a week's time, elements of the US 8th Army were on occupation duty in Japan, were rushed to South Korea to stem the North Korean invasion. As Army soldiers and later Marines of Brigadier General Edward A. Craig's 1st Provisional Marine Brigade fought the NKPA to the outskirts of the port of Busan, the United Nations undertook a series of votes that not only condemned the North Korean invasion, but brought thousands of Allied troops to the assistance of the beleaguered ROK. Among the troops assigned to the Korean theatre was a hastily assembled unit of Royal Marines stationed in Great Britain and Malaya, where they were already engaged in guerrilla war against communist terrorists. The deployment of Royal Marines in Korea. The deployment of Royal Marines to Korea came as the government of Prime Minister Clement R. Attlee announced its intention in the Royal Parliament to add to the forces being sent to Korea. While there was some disagreement with his... While there was some disagreement with this decision amongst the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Viscount William Slim, and Chief of the Air Staff, Marshal Arthur W. Tedder, both of whom argued that Britain was already engaged in active operations in Malaya as important. That doesn't make any sense. While there was some disagreement with this decision amongst the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Viscount William Slim, and Chief of the Air Staff, Marshal Arthur W. Tedder, both of whom argued that Britain was already engaged in active operations in Malaya as important, and Chief of the Air Staff, Marshal Arthur W. Tedder, and Chief of the Air Staff, Marshal Arthur W. Tedder, both of whom argued that Britain was already engaged in important operations in Malaysia as important, Encountering communists as important. Oh. Air Staff Marshal Arthur W. Tedder, both of whom argued that Britain was already engaged in important operations in Malaya as important in encountering communist expansion in Korea. Admiral Lord Fraser of North Cape, the First Sea Lord, strenuously advocated for the dispatch of a brigade-sized force of Royal Marines to operate in unison with the US Navy as a commando. To operate in unison with the US Navy strenuously advocated for the dispatch of a brigade-sized force of Royal Marines to operate in unison with the US Navy as a commando raiding force. Within 2 weeks of Lord Fraser's decision on the 16th of August 1950, a 300-man Royal Marine unit was formed and took the name of 41 Independent Commando. Independent, in the unit designation, meant the commanding officer had sole responsibility for the unit and did not have to consult higher British headquarters on operational and logistical matters. The commandos were drawn mostly from the active duty units, individual Marine reservists preparing to depart for service in Malaya as part of 3 Commando Brigade. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Douglas B. Drysdale, a seasoned Marine veteran who had served with distinction as a member of 3 Commando in the Far East during World War II, 41 Independent Commando began preparations for service in Korea. The Marines assembled at the... no, they didn't. Damn, didn't record. It was going so well. Where did I end? And logistical matters. Right. Whoops. The commandos were drawn mostly from the active duty units and individual Marine reservists preparing to depart for service in Malaya as part of 3 Commando Brigade. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Douglas B. Drysdale, a seasoned Marine veteran who had served with distinction as a member of 3 Commando in the Far East during World War II, 41 Independent Commando began preparations for service in Korea. The Marines assembled at the Royal Marine Barracks at Bickley. The Marines assembled at Royal Marine Barracks at Bickley, Devon, site of the Commando School, where they received the customary inoculations and issue of uniforms prior to their deployment to the Far East. Initially, 41 Commando drew from 3 separate contingents. The first, organised from volunteers and reservists in the United Kingdom, was flown from Bickley, not Brickley. I said the first. From 3 separate contingents. There it is. The first, organised from volunteers and reservists in the United Kingdom, was flown from Bickley to Japan in civilian. The first, organised from volunteers and reservists in the United Kingdom, was flown from Bickley to Japan in civilian clothes to conceal the ultimate destination and employment. The second group comprised volunteer sailors and marines drawn from the British Pacific Fleet. This group already had begun intensive periods of training even before the main body of the Royal Marines character. Oh dear, this is not going to be easy. This group split over the page in different columns. Let's grab that and start Notepad. Paste that in there and roll the PDF page forward a bit so I can see where it continues. Right. Drawn from the British Pacific Fleet. This group already had begun an intensive period of training, even before the main body of the Royal Marines arrived from Great Britain and had been organised into a rifle section known as the Fleet Volunteers. The third group came from a reinforcement draft destined for 3, 40, 42 and 45 Commando in Malaya, and was on board the British troopship HMT Devonshire, which had been HMT Devonshire. On board the British troopship HMT Devonshire, which had been diverted to Japan in early August. Vice Admiral C. Turner Joy, Commander Naval Forces Far East, and Admiralty officials in London. Did I just whistle? Vice Admiral C. Turner Joy, Commander Naval Forces Far East, and Admiral... I did. Early August. Vice Admiral C. Turner Joy, Commander Naval Forces Far East, and Admiralty officials in London and Washington, D.C., decided the Royal Marines would operate the... Vice Admiral C. Turner Joy, Commander Naval Forces Far East, and Admiralty officials in London and Washington, D.C., decided the Royal Marines would operate with the US Navy and Marines. After arriving at Camp McGill, a US Army base 50 miles south of Tokyo at Takahama and near the US Navy base of Yokosuka, the commander received a complete field issue of uniforms, weapons and equipment supplied by the US Army. To maintain their distinct character and proud lineage, American military officials permitted the Royal Marines to retain their unique green berets, as the Royal Marines trained on weapons familiarization, small unit tactics and raiding techniques, and conducted physical fitness exercises. Admiral Joy decided to use them as a raiding force along the enemy's long and vulnerable coastline. Of thickets, gardens and olive groves, screening several lanes and bypaths that had led down to the ferries. Such of the boats as had not been scuttled had been brought over to the north bank. But they were not all protected by proper guards. This was inexcusably careless. The main blame must fall on the Marshal for his party press in refusing to look upstream. Refusing to look upstream. using refusing to look upstream, though some must also be reserved for General Quesnel, the governor of Oporto, and for Foy, the the brigadier whose battalions were in charge of the eastern suburb of the city. But the fact was that none of the French officers dreamed of the possibility that Wellesley might make an attempt on the very on the the on the on the very morning of his arrival, to cross the tremendous obstacle interposed in his way by the rolling stream of the Douro. That he would deliver a frontal attack on them in full daylight was beyond the limits of probable. They had no conception of the enterprise of the man with whom they had to deal. There was this amount of truth in their view, that the British general would not have made his daring stroke at Oporto unless he had ascertained that the carelessness of his adversaries had placed an unexpected chance in his hands. By 10 o'clock in the morning, Wellesley had concentrated behind Villanova the whole of his force. The three columns of Paget, Hill and Sherbrooke were now up in line. They were kept out of sight of the enemy, some in the lateral lanes of the suburb, but the majority hidden behind the back slope of the hills, where orchards and vineyards gave them complete cover from observers on the northern bank.